If I have one takeaway from the comments on my last video, it's that a lot of people are under the impression that planar magnetic driver IEMs like these are especially hard to drive. And if I think about it, I have seen that as kind of a recurring theme in the comments on my reviews over the years. So are planar IEMs actually hard to drive? Well, hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review. And in this episode of Waveguide, I'm going to answer that question. The question, are planar driver IEMs hard to drive? And by hard to drive, we mean, do you need like especially powerful amplifiers in order to get the best sound quality out of them? Or can you just run them out of a laptop or an Apple dongle? That is basically what we mean by something as being hard to drive. Is you need a powerful amplifier for it. Is that true with planar IEMs? We're going to dig into that. And if you like the idea of helpful content like this, you're also going to like our sponsor, HiFiGo. They're an online retailer of all kinds of audiophile things, including amplifiers, including planar IEMs. So if you want to check them out, I'll have them linked down below. But otherwise, let's talk about this. So I thought it would be useful to just start with some definitions, right? What are we talking about when we talk about planar IEMs? Because planar can kind of mean a bunch of different things. What are we talking about when we mean hard to drive, and like by what standard, right? These are the kinds of things I wanted to set out from the get-go. And we're talking about planar IEMs. We're talking about IEMs like these. These are IEMs that kind of came onto the scene, I want to say like 3 years ago, starting with the 7 Hz timeless, right? There was a 7 Hz timeless. There was, of course, the Let Shure S12. In fact, I don't know where did I put my timeless? It should be around here somewhere. But anyway, I've got the timeless. It's going to be involved in this, I promise you. Including, the 64 audio solo. We've got the Let Shure S08, as well as the more recent Kiwi Ears Aether. And why I think these are all like good representations of what we mean by a planar IEM is that they're all using kind of like some variation of this 14.5 to 15.5 millimeter planar driver that is, I don't know if it's the exact same driver that's being used in a bunch of these IEMs, but it feels like it is part of a very similar family of drivers that you see consistently, because there's certain sound characteristics you'll see represented by these planar IEMs. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of all the planar IEMs on the market. In fact, I've got more that I could have brought out included in this test, but I think this is a decent representative example of what we mean by a planar IEM. And I guess also just to say what we don't mean by a planar IEM, right? There's some newer IEMs that are using these microplanar drivers for the high frequency stuff. Like think like a Dunu, oh my gosh, what is it? The DK3001 BD, the Brain Dance. That's got planar drivers in it, but that's kind of a different thing than what we're talking about here. When we're talking about planars, we're talking about this type of IEM. Now, the question again, hard to drive, and I kind of addressed this a little bit in the intro, but what do we mean by hard to drive? And I think there's probably a couple of ways that you could define it. I mean, I talked about how people say hard to drive because it requires a lot of amplification in order to get the maximum, the optimal sound quality out of a product. I'm going to say that pretty much means like volume levels. I know there's some controversy or some disagreement about power equals volume. I feel like that's weird that people disagree about that, but I'm going to say what we're talking about is being able to get IEMs like these to a suitable volume level. Now, what do we even mean by a suitable volume level? Because everyone listens at, frankly, different listening levels, right? And for me, like I actually happen to listen kind of quiet, so I actually might be not as sensitive to power requirements as some other people do who listen on average more loudly than I do. Now, here's what I'll say. I have not like visited an audiologist to do a super detailed study on my listening habits, but what I do have is I have the AirPods Pro, and they have some integration with an iPhone, which I suppose I can put on screen here, that will basically show you, it gives you a readout of the decibel levels of what you're listening to while you're listening to it. It's actually pretty cool. And what I find whenever I've looked at this, when I'm doing that, I'm listening to music on my iPhone through the AirPods Pro, and it usually tells me that I'm listening in like the low 70 decibels range. In fact, right before I did the research for this video, I was listening on this, and it was showing me I was listening at 67 decibels, which is actually pretty quiet. For reference, like I think it's pretty common for people to listen more in like the 75 to 80, maybe even 85 decibel range as kind of like again, a frame of reference. That said, like 85 decibels is, according to like OSHA and some other people who are concerned with health stuff. Look, I'm not here to give you health advice, but a lot of people who are interested in the health of ears will tell you that prolonged listening, prolonged exposure to sound above 85 decibels is damaging to your hearing. Now, I would say that I'm not as worried about it maybe as OSHA is, but let's say 85 decibels is probably about as loud as you should be listening to music, at least for any prolonged amount of time. So those are kind of our standards. Now, the one thing also I kind of wanted to mention is that I've got these two things over here, which are not planar IEMs, because I'm using these as kind of my reference baseline, right? Again, like what is too loud? What is loud enough? Like this is all kind of murky, right? You could disagree about this. But what I'm going to say is like the AirPods Pro at maximum volume is probably louder than anybody needs to be listening to. I cannot listen to these things at maximum volume. In fact, when I was listening to them at what I said was 67 decibels, I was at 50% volume level on the AirPods Pro, all right? So put that into context. And then also, this is the Moondrop LAN. It is a single dynamic driver IEM. It is not a planar IEM. It's just an ordinary $40 budget dynamic driver IEM that I think is kind of representative of the standard, the normal. This is what normal is in terms of sensitivity, although maybe you could quibble and say that the LAN is a little bit less sensitive than your average dynamic driver, but we'll use this as our benchmark. So basically what I'm saying is that, and what I'm kind of setting up is that if these things can approach the volume levels of these using pretty ordinary hardware, I don't know that I would say that they are hard to drive. But if these things are significantly quieter than these things are using ordinary hardware, and then it takes, a balanced amplifier or something else to get these things to volume levels that are comparable to what we would get on these, then yeah, I would say that these are then hard to drive. So you get where I'm going with this? Now, here is where I'm going to lay out kind of my methodology for this. Now, I don't have a calibrated microphone to measure the exact decibels that are coming out of all of these, but I do have this coupler. And I have this thing hooked up to my software, Room EQ Wizard, which I can play a test signal. It basically just plays white noise at certain volume levels, and Room EQ Wizard will tell me what it thinks the decibel rating of that is. Now, I say that's not calibrated because I can technically adjust like the sensitivity of the microphone and get like a higher rating than what it is. So I haven't done that calibration. But what I can say is that I also tested these again as my benchmark. And at 50% volume with the AirPods Pro, hold on, let me pull up my spreadsheet real quick. We've got spreadsheets. I don't think you need to see my spreadsheet. Maybe I'll have it linked in the description below if you want to check out my spreadsheet. But yeah, at 50% volume, Room EQ Wizard said that the AirPods Pro were playing the white noise at around 77 decibels. Okay. Again, when I was listening to music, my iPhone said it was closer to 67 decibels. But Room EQ Wizard, and this is what we're going to be able to measure all these against, said it was 77 decibels, right? So that's kind of our baseline. At 50% volume, these things are 77 decibels. Now, the LAN here at 50% volume, and what I'm using for this as my baseline reference, by the way, is the lowly Apple dongle, right? This is a $9 piece of audio equipment that, frankly, anyone who's bought an iPhone probably has. So it's pretty common, pretty basic. And I would say that if something is drivable off this, it's probably not really hard to drive. But and I would say that's true here of the LAN. Like the LAN gets plenty loud on the Apple dongle. In fact, at 50% volume on the Apple dongle, the LAN is actually louder than the AirPods Pro are at their 50%. Now, obviously, they're not running off the Apple dongle. They're running on their own power, but we're still using that as like a reference point, right? So at 50% volume on the Apple dongle, these things are louder than the AirPods are at my normal listening volume, which again was like 50%, right? And by how much louder? Okay, in Room EQ Wizard, these things measured at, checking my notes, 91 decibels. So again, these were 77 decibels. This is 91 decibels, all right? So clearly, this is, I would say, I don't think anyone would say that this is a hard to drive IEM, because it's getting plenty loud off of this Apple dongle. Okay, so that's kind of my methodology. Anything else to note? Okay, I'm talking about 50% volume in my spreadsheet, which I guess you can see. Well, you know, do you want to see my spreadsheet? Let's just take a look at this spreadsheet together so that you know I'm not fibbing, is right here. This is our spreadsheet, and I know I've got a bunch of stuff on screen, but you can see that I measured each of these IEMs at 25% volume on the Apple dongle, 50%, 75%, and max volume. And these are the results, okay? This is basically the data just laid out in charts. And you can see, again, AirPods Pro, I've got marked in black just so that it's nice and easy to see. And then in red here is the Moondrop Land, which these are, again, kind of our baselines. And at 25, 50%, 75, and 100% volume level, what do you notice? The planar IEMs are louder than the AirPods or the LAN at all of these. And again, these are all being measured on the Apple dongle, right? So at 100% volume on the Apple dongle, using the 7 Hz timeless, for example, it is louder, not a lot louder, but it is louder than the Moondrop LAN. And it is still louder than the AirPods Pro at max volume. So from this, I feel like I can't say that planar IEMs are hard to drive. If anything, in this comparison, they are easier to drive than AirPods or the Moondrop LAN, which might make you wonder then, where does this idea that planar IEMs are hard to drive come from? And I think it's probably twofold. I think part of it is the headphone world, where it's a little more murky, right? Where I talked about all of these are kind of using roughly the same driver. So I think, as we kind of saw in this data, like their sensitivity levels are all pretty similar, right? There's no wild differences here. But in the headphone world, there's just a lot more drivers imaginable. And there are some planar headphones that are, in fact, actually quite a bit hard to drive, right? You do need more amplification than you'll probably get out of an Apple dongle to get them very loud. So I think, you know, there is that truth to it, again, in the headphone world that some people kind of transpose to the IEM world. But I think there is also kind of things like this. Like this is the Tin Hi-Fi P1. This is an old school planar IEM. This one came out way before the ones that I just had on screen. And this one, I would say, I remember this being actually quite hard to drive. I remember this one took quite a bit of power in order for it to get loud. And now you can tell it's old because this cable once upon a time was white and now it's yellow, which just kind of goes to show you that this thing has been around for a while. But I was actually surprised because I definitely remembered this being a hard to drive IEM, but I went back and measured it with my same methodology. And okay, it is less sensitive than these others. So the P1 I've added to this chart in blue, and I've grayed out the other planar IEMs just to make this easier to reference. Again, these are our benchmarks, and the P1 is over here. Versus the Moondrop LAN, the P1 is actually less sensitive than the LAN. At 25% volume, it will be quieter. But what's interesting is that at 25% volume, and even 50% volume on the AirPods Pro, the P1 is actually louder when driven off of an Apple dongle, all right? Again, this is my normal listening levels, which means that if I want to listen to the Tin Hi-Fi P1 on an Apple dongle, I basically, 50% volume is gonna be plenty loud. In fact, it might even be a little bit louder than I would typically listen. And of course, it does still get louder the more volume or the more power you put into this IEM. Although you will see that while the volume in all of these kind of scales pretty linearly, the AirPods Pro doesn't, right? Which is it makes sense to me. They basically are giving you just more control, or more like low volume control, by having a lower baseline, but then it kind of ramps up. And basically what I'm getting at is that, okay, look at that. At maximum volume, yes, the AirPods Pro are more sensitive than the Tin Hi-Fi P1, which is the least sensitive planar IEM that I've got. But again, this is using like a 10mm planar driver that basically nobody uses anymore. So when people talk about, are planar IEMs hard to drive, I really do think that they're referencing planar IEMs like these, not this one that came out 5 or 6 years ago. And I think the truth is that no, they're not hard to drive. You can run these things perfectly fine off of an Apple dongle. Now, this does actually bring up another kind of line of conversation, which I've seen, and I don't know that I'm necessarily prepared to address this in the most exquisite detail, but it's this idea that power doesn't just equal volume, like that by adding more power to the sound, you're not just getting more volume out of the IEM, you're unlocking some other special sound quality properties of the IEM. And this is an interesting, I guess I'm going to call it a myth, but I don't really have a whole lot of backup for that right now, apart from the fact of two things, okay? Well, one, we just saw this, right? More power, this is what increasing the volume level does, is it's increasing the amount of power you're feeding the IEMs, does in fact make these things louder, okay? So if you need more power than this, right? For example, maximum power on an Apple dongle, it is going to be louder than this. And kind of going back to our 85 decibels is like a baseline of where probably you shouldn't be listening louder than 85 decibels. At 75% volume on the Apple dongle, these things are beyond that, okay? I think even given the miscalibrations of my coupler, I think we can safely agree that you probably should not be listening to these IEMs above 75% power on an Apple dongle. So if you're trying to give them more power than the Apple dongle has, you're going to be listening to them much louder than 100 decibels. But are you then unlocking some other magical sound properties? Well, I did also a kind of analysis on this, which again, I need to talk to more people that have this belief and understand it a little bit better. Because here's what I figured out, right? I measured the frequency response of all of these IEMs when I was doing this measurement. Let me hide this real quick. And basically what I have is I have the frequency response of each of these IEMs at 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100% volume on the Apple dongle. And you're looking at 25% now, right? If I add the 50% volume level, you're looking at that now. And if I add the 75% volume level, you're looking at that now. And then I'm also going to add the 100% volume level frequency response. And now what's notable here is that you're looking at all of these frequency responses at once. All four graphs are on the screen right now, but they are just exactly the same. So they overlay on top of each other to the point that you can't see them. You can only see the latest one that I dropped, right? So basically what this is showing me is that these IEMs, their sound profile does not change as volume changes. The only thing, as power changes. The only thing that does change as power changes is the volume level. And I know I'm just showing you one IEM right now. Like if you want to go through it, I've got it for all of them here. It's true for all of these. Again, the Let's Short S12, there it is at 25% volume. Here, I'll just skip to 100% volume. That's 100% volume versus 25% volume. It's the exact same sound signature, okay? Yeah, I don't know that there's anything much else to say about this topic apart from the fact that to answer the question, are planar IEMs hard to drive? I don't think there's really anything here that tells me that planar IEMs are hard to drive. So if you're thinking about buying a planar IEM and you're worried that you don't have like the right amplification for it, I don't think you need to worry about that. I think as long as you've got something as basic as an Apple dongle, you're going to get all of the sound quality out of these things that you can get. And well, if you're interested in buying one, I guess check them out on HiFiGo, who is making waveguide videos like this possible. Shout out again to HiFiGo. I'll have them linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, well, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, which I've also got linked in the description, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews. We now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's begin with the theory.